A história do nosso planeta está sendo escrita todos os dias. Só que ela está ficando quente demais. O aquecimento global é um fato. Mas também é um fato que estamos escrevendo essa história. E ela pode ser diferente. A JBS, uma das maiores produtoras de alimentos do mundo, apresentou um compromisso global. JBS Net Zero. Até 2040, ano após ano, ela vai melhorar ainda mais o jeito que produz, com 100% de energia limpa e reduzindo emissões de gases de efeito estufa. Hoje, a JBS já exige desmatamento ilegal zero e monitora todos os seus fornecedores. Até quem vende para eles começou a ser também. E vai ter muito investimento em ciência para criar novas tecnologias. Não vai ser fácil, mas será feito. Para tudo isso sair do papel. JBS. Alimentar a mudança é o nosso compromisso.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here once again for one more webinar, one more live for our Brazilian Coalition special for COP26, which is going to take place in Glasgow in a few weeks. This is an initiative. It's a partnership of the Valor Econômico newspaper and the Brazilian Coalition for Forest, Agriculture, and Climate for the GPS Net Zero and Nestlé. They are the sponsors for this initiative. I'm André Guimarães. I'm the executive director for IPAM, and I'm also a member of the Brazilian Coalition for Climate, Forest, and Agriculture. The event we have today, ladies and gentlemen, is an epilogue of the process that started in April of this year. A series of 6 live sections. We discussed several aspects of the climate convention, aiming at promoting, first of all, a debate with society, bringing elements into discussion for this very important topic, but also, and just as important, to build recommendations for our decision makers, our negotiators that are going to be present in the Glasgow conference. So actually advance on this debate, even more than a debate, just an implementation of the commitments of the several countries, including Brazil, for the mitigation of climate change. As I said, this is the last event of the series that tries and brings some of that debate for society, for decision makers. Throughout this process of several months, we had several information pieces, had the privilege of having dozens of specialists, people engaged in the topic, knowledgeable about the topic, that enriched this debate. As a result of the discussion, that the coalition and Valor Econômico promoted, we have a report. This report is available on the coalition webpage. It's Coalizão BR, coalizãobr.com.br. You have all the roster of information there, including the report that has been recently drafted. It is going to be delivered to the Brazilian negotiators. And just summarize, we will dig deeper during our discussion. This report brings 5 major points. The structure of our report to try and motivate higher engagement and commitment for a successful climate conference in Glasgow. We have 5 points, as I said. First off, to raise the ambition. As a collective of countries in the world, to have to increase commissions. We're going to reach undesirable climate changes by the end of the century of 2.5 degrees, maybe over 3 degrees, and have to reach at less than 2 degrees of temperature increase by the end of the century, which was the same as pre-industrial period. And to make a more accelerated process of carbon emission, also need regulation for carbon markets. This is a critical element. The third element that has been quite present throughout the discussions we've been promoting over the last few months is valuing ecosystems, nature based solutions based on the maintenance and recovery of ecosystems in nature. This is a very important element, and it's pretty clear on the last report, the last IPCC report. The panel of scientists that are in the climate convention. We should maintain forests and equality of natural environment and natural resources. So this positively impacts climate change. The fourth point is enabling funding and a new financial architecture that incorporates environmental services, carbon markets, but not only that, we need to finance a new economic model that allows activities to be developed in more sustainable ways. That is an important challenge as well. This coalition report also includes that, and maybe the most important point this whole discussion brings up is the importance of helping vulnerable communities, helping balance the strengths for us to counter the climate change, the climate change challenge. Also to balance out, to harmonize asymmetries. That's a critical element for us to counter this process of climate change with social fairness, incorporation of several human communities in the process. We'll be discussing this here today. Without further ado, this report is available. It is public. It will be delivered soon to those responsible for negotiations in Brazil. And we understand that Brazil has an important contribution to make. We are a climate, bioeconomic, agricultural, environmental power. And this whole set of elements and strengths of our country bring on the one side a set of opportunities and responsibilities on the other side for us to address the private sector, academia, civil society, government, to address this challenge, which is mitigation of climate change. Now, we have the privilege actually to have three very special people that will be sharing this space with me, and Daniela Chiaretti is a journalist with Valor Econômico. She will be introducing herself shortly. To promote this debate here with us, three people that I believe they're very special. First off, Marcelo Fuktado. Just like me, he's a member of the coalition. He's an ex-facilitator of the coalition. He dedicated a lot of energy to put coalition in the place where it is today. He's the director of sustainability of CO2 Block, and he's a visiting professor of the Columbia University of the United States. We have the privilege to have Natalia Renteria. She's a lawyer and attorney, and she's a dear partner of the coalition. She's a technical manager of climate change at SEBED, the Entrepreneurs Council for Sustainable Development. I have the great privilege to have Sanea do Vale. She is a friend from IPAN. I have the pleasure to have you with us today. She is speaking with us with a bit of a complicated connection. She is drafting a strategic plan of community zoning where she works, but she's here with us today, dedicating herself to the debate. She's the coordinator of the Environmental Management Council for Roraima. She drafted the first indigenous publication to counter climate change. I'll try and talk, but correct me if I'm wrong. The Amazat Pana Adiham, which is the perception of indigenous communities on climate change. Sinea is from the Serra da Lua region in Roraima. Marcelo, Natalia, Sinea, welcome and thank you for being here with us today. Dani, over to you. So introduce yourself and we start our wealthy debate.
Good afternoon, Andre. Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. It is a great pleasure to share this mediation with you and Natalia, Marcelo, and Sinea. And on behalf of Valor Econômico newspaper, I can say that this series of webinar has been very interesting, as you said, with so many different points of view and approaches, and bringing a very, very rich debate now that we are just a few days away from the Glasgow's COP26. And let's just listen to what everyone has to say. Now, back to you, Andre.
Thank you. It is a privilege to be here with you, sharing this talk on climate, environment, global challenges that we are facing. I'd like to start off by asking each of our guests to make their initial remarks. So we warm up our talk. You go first, Marcelo. You you are familiar with the cause. You know the climate change were involved in this agenda, and we're pretty aware of the topic. What do you have to say about this moment, Marcelo? The circumstance we're going through, like Danny said, we're a few weeks away from Glasgow. There are a lot of expectations. The coalition society, governments are mobilized and ready for negotiation. What is the way ahead, Marcelo? Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Dani, Sinea, Natalia, and all those watching us. I'd like to start off a little bit of the script with a celebration. It is impossible not to comment a coalition event with Sinea with us. And Sinea, just for you to understand why I'm talking about this, the coalition started in 2015, and in 2015, we saw that it is impossible to talk about the Brazil we want without including the indigenous voices in this conversation. But it took us a while for us as a coalition, as private sector, academia, civil society, to manage to incorporate that. Of course, this year we drafted a document of coalition's opinion, highlighting how important indigenous communities are in this discussion of climate and nature for the country. So I would like to acknowledge that it is pretty nice as an organization, like we've existed for 6 years now, we are constantly evolving. Having said that, it is important to say that our report, our contribution, well, we did say it was written for COP26, but it's actually for COP26, the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow. But thinking about the connection, this COP 26 has with CBB, the COP 15 that is to happen in China. Part of it happened this year, and there will be more next year, in connection with COP 27 in Africa. So our contribution is much more on the journey of the climate discussion rather than a just a temporary reunion. So our contribution, our comes from nature and climate. It's not just about climate change. It's not just about carbon. We're talking about the environmental issue, and economic and social issue in the climate and nature context. In my opinion, that's the big novelty of COP26, the effort to bring those 2 points more robustly, perhaps from the global negotiation standpoint, connecting that with CBD and bringing this topic up in a more integrated fashion, given that we work on the field either via public policies, private sector actions, advocacy action from civil society, but we have been pledging this for many years now. If you ask the presidency of COP26, they listed as COP priorities 4 topics: ambition, adaptation, finances, and engagement. I'd like to draw your attention. It is very interesting. We did not we were not based on that to draft a report, but our report includes ambition, valuing ecosystem, which is adaptation, and then we talk about carbon market. and finance mechanisms, which goes to finance, and we finish off by talking about engagement. So there's a total dialogue between what we are presenting, either for Brazilian negotiators or Brazilian society, as well as for the international society. Given the urgency that we are talking, that IPCC has in the last report, AR6, this heavily pushes what's going to happen in Glasgow, puts a lot of pressure on what's going to happen in Glasgow. As Danny is pretty well aware, there are three meetings at the same time. There's a meeting going on within the negotiation rooms, the whole thing, like brackets and languages and so on. And then there's a meeting that's going on outside of the negotiation room in the hallways where you see the possibilities for the future. And there's a whole another meeting outside of the United Nations environment, because today it's going to be in Glasgow, but it was Paris and so many other cities once, including Rio. There are plenty of activities, the private sector, civil society, that others are performing. Maybe the highlight here is that the biggest novelty is going to be the huge participation, in spite of all the difficulties that indigenous people will have in the conference, either influencing what's going to happen on the conference or talking to society. This is a novelty that we have to acknowledge, and this is a result of a UCN meeting that happened in Marseille, where a motion was approved to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025, with 100 votes, 60 of which for and 40 abstentions. That in this diplomatic world, an abstention mean I agree, but I cannot vote, but I'm not going to block, which is part of the solution as well. This is a very important moment for countries such as Brazil, because it shows that biodiverse countries that have this bioeconomic potential we have, are highly accountable and have a great opportunity. But none of that is going to be true if we keep the alarming and absolutely unacceptable numbers of deforestation we have in the country. So when we analyze all of those opportunities, the only way for us to join this opportunity to create this prosper economy that respects a social base and is within a planetary limit is by adapting that to a country that solved its deforestation issue. So there's a very clear question, Andre, for us Brazilians. What do we as society want to do about this? So in our coalition report, we have the 6 practical measures, because there are instruments. They have absolute applicability in this moment to fight deforestation as a priority for Brazil regarding its climate ambition. I would also highlight how important it is to value ecosystems, because that addresses the maintenance of biodiversity on the one side with all the ecosystem services it represents, but also it also represents the important role our forests and biomes play in carbon capture. So I'm going to wrap up my first comments by provoking, more important than a document that brings out alternatives and proposals. I would like to say that it is a document that was written in such a polarized moment of the country. It was drafted with civil society, with science, with academia, and the private sector, showing that We can imagine a country that addresses, the tackles economic development, income challenges with social environmental prosperity while respecting science. Thank you. Thank you, dear Marcelo. That does shed a light to our talk. I was thinking exactly of a word, which is convergence. Convergence. When you mentioned the four priority of the COP presidency aligned with coalition's 5 point, this is not by accident. We know what we have to do. We know we have to allocate capital. We know we have to protect nature. We know we have to end deforestation. So in my head, I keep thinking, why is this not done? But we will be talking about that later. Just a little bit of what our discussion is going to go towards later. Thanks, Marcelo, for your first comments. I'm going to jump from Marcelo to my right to over to you, Natalia, to my left. From Sebed, who's been studying carbon markets for so long now. I want to hear from you what we can expect from that, as Marcelo said, not only from this event right now, but maybe the consequence for next months and years to come that we will be seeing in Glasgow. Natalia, over to you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. It's great to be able to discuss this with you all. And as I hear Marcelo saying all about this journey and climate discussions with it, which is in constant evolution, what we've seen in regard to carbon market is some sort of lack of comprehension because it's very new. Our population is just finding out about this, just starting to hear about it. What is this? Is this good? Is this bad? This is what I've been hearing. And in this journey, Sebets has been developing strategies and shedding light at this discussion. I would like to give a step back and try to explain how the carbon market is valid and how this emerged and how this can help us. Just trying to clear any concerns people may have, because some people think this is not a very good idea or a good way out. I'd like to mention three initial elements in this regard to climate that leads us to carbon market. First of all, let's just remember the basics of climate. It is a global phenomenon. It doesn't matter where this carbon is emitted, it's going to go to the atmosphere and it's going to affect everyone. We have a dependency on states. We need to understand climate governance. I cannot force my neighbor to make a move on this, but if they don't do anything, this is going to affect me, and they don't know it or don't understand it. We need to understand that the international cooperation is important to address these issues. And this all brings a lot of complexity to the issue. And these are not very easy solutions. This idea of global concern reminds us that these emissions, they just spread in the globe. And although it's a problem that is everywhere, the solution, and this is a consequence, the solution to this could also be anywhere. And this broadens the possibilities for solutions with the market and the actions that we may take. This mobility brings the consequence of generating possibilities of flexibilizations, different measures, the discovery of new possibilities to diminish emissions in the globe. And carbon markets means to put in practice the possibilities of flexibilizations to decrease the emissions. Let's try to understand this further. In Kyoto was an instrument of climate change. It posed some challenges to countries so that they could decrease their emissions. Before that, countries did not have that obligation. Uh, Through Kyoto, mechanisms were given to those developed countries so that they could decrease their emissions in other territories other than their own. But this did not avoid the creation of other rules so that these countries could decrease their emissions in their own country. So trying to reduce the emissions outside their own country does not overrides the ability for you to do the same in your country. And this is not the case. Uh, and towards this rationale, we had called Paris, which posed a mandatory, an obligation for countries to decrease. In Brazil, we started with this commitment of reduction starting in Paris COP25. And and let's talk about Brazil now. We are in a moment of Brazil in which we are building our regulatory laws and framework with measures that can allow us to decrease our emissions. Regulated market and volunteer markets are one of these policies. This is a puzzle that is being assembled today. And this is why it's just so important for us to talk about this right now. It's a set of measurements that is uh, ripening up, gaining momentum. We have PL 528 that is discussing this, and that there is a possibility that is real, so that we can have proper legislation for the carbon market in Brazil for the first time. Because today what we have is a volunteer market, and it is not encompassed by any legislation that puts mandatory actions into place. It's a more of a free territory today. And what I'd like to say in regard to this carbon market policy is that we have to see this as something to leverage. It's one of the measures that can be taken in order for us to reduce our figures. It's not a silver bullet, of course. This is not the only solution possible for the problem, but it poses possibilities. As Marcelo said, it's going to give proper value to our act, to our resources, and this market can put in evidence all of our potential as a country. This does not puts away or overrides any of the strategies that we have in place. So this is why I wanted to say during the first considerations that I had. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a nice perspective there. Again, when I listen to you, I think to myself, without market, it's gonna take too long. I think the market shortens the timeline for us to actually eliminate carbon emissions so we can turn the curve. I mean, all markets have had failures during the Kyoto cycle, but we have to learn from the failures and correct them. And hopefully, the famous Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is regulated and we put that market with rights and wrongs, but throughout the process we shorten time frames. We'll be back to you on carbon market and finance to see how this leverage is going to put the world into track of climate change mitigation. Not to well, I'm going to invite everyone to ask questions via chat. They tell me all the time, but I forget. So this time I didn't forget. I'm inviting everyone to write your questions via chat so we will reach the debate. After the first considerations, we go to my questions, Danny's questions, and the questions of all of you who are watching us. Without further ado, I'd like to invite you, Sinea. It is a privilege to have you. I should confess that I got a picture of Sinaya. She is in an open area in Roraima, and I believe she is in her community. She's sitting, leaning against a wall, holding her mobile phone so she talks to us. So, Sinaya, one more time, thank you for the privilege of having your knowledge, the knowledge of indigenous communities. We talk a lot about this, about our partnership in IPAN. We say that indigenous, on the one side, have an extremely important role because their territories hold and maintain carbon. They keep ecological and natural cycles. On the other side, there are peoples and populations that are at risk of being heavily affected and have a high degree of vulnerability to climate change. And of course, people like you have been following this climate agenda and been working on this climate agenda. As Marcelo said in the beginning, I hope that indigenous communities and traditional populations get ready for these moments. But without further ado, I'd like to stop here to listen to you. I want to see how you see this moment, the conference that's going to take place. What about the participation of indigenous communities and traditional peoples in this discussion? Has this improved or not? What kind of expectations do you have? Sinaya do Vale, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Marcelo and Natalia. I want to say that I'm very emotional and very moved by everything Andre said because it's not easy. It is not easy to take part in discussions. I'm doing my best. I'm trying very hard, and I've been following these discussions along. It's a technical and knowledge discussion. So thank you very much, Andre and Marcelo, for including the indigenous peoples in this coalition and uh, Valor's event, and also in the document. In this climate agenda, we play a central role because we are indigenous people. The climate change is already there. They've reached the communities all over the world. This is why the traditional peoples get together and we talk about it all the time. And talking about this theme means talking about the right of indigenous peoples to land, their right to being in the forest anywhere in the world. Because with the knowledge of indigenous peoples, we have been doing a lot to keep the forest standing, to keep water available. And along with science, I get back to what Andre said. I also have a friend called Paulo that he carries out research in the theme, and I always say that to him. I say to him the following: it's important, but research needs to listen to indigenous peoples because they know the situation, they live the situation, they coexist in this, and they know the forest and they know what happens with climate change. So, in this regard, there's no we shouldn't put documents together just close to the to COPs meetings. This is serious to all peoples, indigenous people or people who live in cities. Climate change is bringing effect to everyone. And it's fast. It's happening at fast pace, and people are not actioning. They are not moving. They're just putting goals ahead 2050, 2060. But today, uh, bringing projections is not enough. As a consequence, we need to know what's going to happen in 26 or 60, of course. But as indigenous people, what we are doing is we are putting our plans together in regard to climate change and preservation. We have organizations that represent us, and we are just now putting a plan together in fight for climate change, including the Amazon indigenous peoples. And we know COP26 is ahead. How many COPs have we followed? How much time do we have in COPs to talk about climate change? How much time is given for us to talk about climate change from the indigenous people's perspective? And it's hard, it's difficult. We know that getting all knowledge together and the UNFCCC platform of indigenous people in local communities, this is being addressed. It's an official institution that is already there. We are trying to be part of this COP26 with our knowledge. Uh, the farthest community needs to be heard. When we talk about climate in these four themes that are going to be addressed at COP26 for us to discuss, we need to look at Brazil and we verify how resources are getting here to be implemented in areas that are indigenous and non-indigenous, because we know that resources such as funding, for example, how is one slice going to be shared to those who really need this, those who are with hands at work, really doing things for climate change and not just projecting. And I talk on behalf of indigenous people and people who live by rivers. More and more, we are managing to get into countries and have access to this sort of resources. We have the Forest Fund in Brazil today. That came with the Ministry of Environment, and this is going to be managed. We call this so that they can be public policies that can be used so that we can do more than we have already been doing for the climate and preservation, and so that we can also put together plans for the mitigation of climate change. So when I look at COP26, and when I look at what Brazil is taking there, and we do not see the reductions that were planned for us to do through the public policies, I look at the Paris Agreement and I see that in Brazil, we haven't advanced much since the last COP. We have not advanced because we don't have anything concrete. We just have words. And uh, we change presidents and the policies are there, but action is not happening. So we are restlessly looking for solutions because we depend on the forest. But not only us, the whole world depends on the forest, because if Earth keeps on heating up the way it is, no strategic plan on carbon is going to be there for us, because maybe it's going to be too late. Uh, we need to do something so that all countries and presidents, they can be discussed they can be discussing climate change as a country and as the planet. If earth had stopped if earth could stop all emissions just now, we'd still keep on heating as a planet. So this is what I wanted to say. We just need to sit together, talk, local communities, indigenous people, all countries in the same page, addressing climate with responsibility, with public policies, and also with the investment of resources where it is really needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sine. Again, I am the one who thank you. You have shed light on several points on the path we should take with your truthful words. Thank you for your partnership. Thank you for your honesty and for the wealth you bring to our debate. I have to comment on an information. In my opinion, this is important and it brings the size of what Sane just talked about. In the Amazon, we have nearly one third of the Amazon, or 30% or so. That's indigenous territories. Dani, Natalia, Marcelo are pretty well aware of that. This part of the Amazon that has in Sinea's relatives, their guardians, they keep on their leaves, on the roots, on the trees, something nearly 2 to 3 years of carbon emission for the whole planet Earth. This brings a dimension of how important it is to keep the integrity of those lands, because today they are in great dimension executed by those people, by those indigenous and traditional peoples in the front line. In spite of all the difficulties they've been suffering, that's what Sanea has been doing, and that's what indigenous leaderships in Brazil and the world do today. Sanaya, thank you for your words and for the privilege once again to have you today shedding light in our path. We'll be talking more later. We're going to dig deeper, but it has touched me. I'm kind of, I have no concentration here. So, Danny, please help me. Otherwise, I start asking questions, emotional questions, and we need to keep focus. and no one's better than you to help me asking questions. So let's get started with the moves on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, everyone. Very interesting what I heard, really. I have questions for everybody. We could start with Sinea. Let's see. Sinea, just as a reminder, she's a Wapishana indigenous person, and she's a reference. She has spoken at the COOP in April with President Biden, and this name does resonate to all of you. And I think it is very interesting. And what I say here, Fabio Scarano, called the attention that in Brazil, we have more languages that there are available at the United Nations. We have about 300 languages in Brazil. And I find something interesting. If I can start with Sinea first, Andre, if I may, which is the following. Sinea, you say something that is very important in your speech. It's not just about the carbon. The forest is much more than this. It's the indigenous people, it's the diversity altogether. I'd like to ask you, how are you going to get to COP26? It's going to be a very difficult conference. Logistics is going to be complicated because of the pandemics, but I think it is interesting if you can let us know of how you're going to get there and what are your expectations. Well, thank you very much for this question. I think it's important to ask this at this moment. We decided that we are leveling all the conversations. We are talking about all of the themes. We are preparing ourselves to do this. Of course, we don't have all the support that we wish we did, but one of the partners that helped us with the COP in regard to language, this has not been a barrier in regard to climate discussion. We have people who speak Spanish, people who speak English, but I went there to COP so many times. I understand a lot of what is said in English. I don't have any issues with language and space of negotiations. Uh, but well, we are preparing ourselves to speak the indigenous people's voices at COP26 in regard to climate change and in regard to climate justice, as it is being discussed. But of course, everyone talks about climate change, but justice is about having policies for everybody. And we are really harming rights in regard to climate, but not only with climate. We need to occupy as many spaces as possible. There is an indigenous peoples pavilion. There is an agenda, and we have to take all of the voices together with us. We are going to discuss justice, climate justice, and climate change. We are bringing this strategy to cope together along with us, and we know that this space is for the indigenous people's voices. It's a voice for denouncing, and it is discussions that are already being taken place among indigenous communities. And we are going to discuss at equal levels with everyone. When we talk about climate change, we are not only talking about indigenous peoples. We're not going to talk only about indigenous issues. We know that we are moving backwards in regard to climate change discussions and policies, especially food supply and water and the standing forest. Everything is affected by the climate changes. A group of very prepared indigenous people, indigenous lawyers, and going to cope with a strategy, leveled up information so that we can discuss at the same level with everyone because we are talking about climate. If we need to talk to any president, we are ready. We have Caucus Indígena, which is a space for indigenous people at COOP. We are going to have a facilitator there for local communities, and we are also going to discuss a lot of the themes there. And I want to say that the involvement on on climate change and indigenous people themes is for us to help in climate change and just justice. We have a lot to talk, and we want to present our strategies at COOP. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you, Sinea. Well, if I can just start a round of questions to everyone. I'd like to ask a question to Natalia, and Marcelo can wait a little bit. Natalia is a, an extraordinary reference for carbon market studies. She knows this theme really well. It's a very difficult subject, but she knows a lot about it. I have two questions to pose up front. One is the following. There is a recurrent criticism we hear is that the world needs to cut emissions urgently. The way things are, as Andre said, we are heading towards uh, a path to increasing 2 degrees. The carbon market is not delaying this decision that is possible. I'd like to hear from you. What do you think about this criticism? And the second one, you've mentioned the PL, that was a project of law created by the Deputy Marcelo Ramos, creating the carbon market for Brazil. The seabeds took an important part in this, creating a substitution, which is what the market would like to happen. And I'd like to know from you, do you think that law is voted before COP or not? Do you think this should be something to be rushed upon or not? Okay, let's do it. First, I would like to say that I share Andres' emotional moment. The value of the standing for it is much more than a problem of a tree. We have the forest ecosystem, the indigenous peoples, the local population. They are the real richness. So I do share Andres' emotion and still recover my emotions until now. The criticism towards the carbon market is recurrent, and I understand it. And this is why I decided to make my introduction today, highlighting that the carbon market is one part of the whole mechanism. This avoids other policies to be in place in order to mitigate. The importance is very clear because it deals with the problem of the cost that the carbon brings to production. It is important to understand that the carbon in our society brings uh, problems and prejudice, and we need to take care of this cost of carbon in our lives. I would like to highlight another side of the carbon market, which is the following. It creates a wave of actions around it that makes the climate economy bloom. I'm going to give you one example that may illustrate this. Suppose you have a company. Today, there's no regulatory market in this regard. So, sectors that could in the future be regulated, the industry and energy, for example, let's suppose we have a company that says, well, I want to decrease my emission targets. They are going to have a target, a goal established, and they are going to start working towards that reduction. They're going to say, supplier, if you use a car with a larger emissions, I need you to use an electric car. And this is how they are going to operate, not just internally, in its ecosystem as a whole. They can start activating and asking for changes from suppliers, from partners, in order to bring this great change that we are expecting to happen. If on one side the volunteer market is activating these forest communities because the credits that feed the volunteer market they come most of the times, as we know, know from that they come from the forest and from the agriculture, and these are areas that can provide us with volunteer credits, and this can generate local economy, which is going to be also activated by the generation of credit. So when we talk about this market, we cannot only talk about this credit that is being generated or this such activity that is being regulated. We need to look outside in the outskirts of the process. This is going to create a whole new process with new baselines and with new objectives, the way we are doing it. You asked about PL 528. And I do believe we have a very special moment in Brazil now. Traditionally, when we look at our history on climate legislation have been adopted very close to COP dates. Of course, the future belongs to God, but we know our past and we can look back and see that a few weeks before COP or after COP, we implemented and voted laws. The expectation is that this is a window of opportunity. We are talking about this, we are discussing the theme, respecting our tradition of legislation, and this opens up a chance for us to be able to start regulating this market because we haven't done so far. Two things can happen. The carbon credits of the volunteer market, they can be discredited and they can lose reputation, and for Brazil our credits need to be firmly respected and that they respect the integrality and that they can safeguard from the social perspective, and it's important to be included in the legislation that's going to be implemented. We want it to be within our laws. It has to be strong, trustworthy. And on another side, we expect that the regulated market allows our companies to not suffer barriers or impositions that other countries are going to start implementing in case we do not uh, change the way we carry this out in our industrial sector. This is what we have to do in order to keep on being competitive internationally. Thank you. Well, I think you're in return, Natalia. And if I could move forward and pose another question, I'm I would like everyone to please pose your questions. Please send your questions and we can address them to the speakers. Marcelo, I'd like to know from you one thing that came from Cinea's speech. She said that the goals are for 2050, 2060, and there's this rush to very far goals. We are in 2021 now. In 2050 or 2060, maybe this is something very comfortable for governments to achieve, right? How how do you see this? Will there be more governments? Will they hand it over? Does it make sense? People say it does not make sense because this is a sort of ambition that's going to be postponed and really empty. What do you think about this? What about these commitments that are just so far ahead in time?
Thank you for your question, Danny. I'll start answering your question by saying that unfortunately, not only 2050 is that far away, but with the distance between us and 2050 is the same distance between us and Eco 92, which means that 2050 is round the corner and 2030 is even closer. So, planning and presenting a robust plan of decarbonization in time is absolutely coherent and correct. It allows you to plan your decarbonization journey. And then you can plan what moments you transition, you make the important transitions, either in terms of energy or materials or food, or even a transition we don't talk too much about, which is behavior. That is a very important transition we need, either from people such as consumers or as voters. So these commitments are pretty important. Now, what is the value of 2050 commitment when you say, well, charge the actions from me in 2015, in 2049? The fundamental question when someone shows a 2050 net zero plan is, what are you going to do in 2021, 2022, 2023, and so on and so forth? Yeah,
Just one thing, I'm talking
2050.
about 2050. You are using a terminology that people may not understand in the future. You're saying something in English, but this is just to clarify to the audience. But now that I've interrupted you, it is just a matter of how you look at things. 2050 is 30 years ahead. It's an eternity if climate change is urgent. Marcelo, it is important, but all the governments that are now here, they are not going to be here anymore, to say the least. And the consumers of today will be around 40 to 50, if not more, in the future. So, starting to provoke a little bit again, don't you think this is a very far ahead horizon?
Well, you see that, by the way, most organizations start to say what they're going to do by 2030, not 2050, bringing those goals way closer. But the point I'd like to reinforce that counters what you say is, for the action plans, you need total transparency. And in English, we call them accountability, right? With accountability, actually, the bottom line is, what are the sectors going to do to deliver that change? Now, we have members in the coalition like WRI that carried out a study with CBETS, Febraban, and so many other partners. And they said that Brazil can have an economy with 42% reduced emissions by 2050, generating 19 billion reais more with sustainable agriculture and 2 more million jobs. Yesterday, the Climate Development Group, a network of organizations, they published a study saying that if you have a an economic recovery that considers our inequality, you can not only recover economically but also reduce emissions. Again, by looking at 2050, you can reduce emissions and include, from the social standpoint, a part of Brazil that is not part of the economy today. So, for me, what is more important in those conversations is precisely how you're going to plan your new guidelines. In the coalition, we had a study of what the coalition view for 2030, 2050 is, what Brazil needs to do in terms of agriculture and forest management to tackle that that challenge. And the solution is not in 2050. The solution is way before, because you have to have a peak of emissions around 2030 and start decarbonizing since then in the planet. But Brazil, particularly because of the conditions we have, so prosperous conditions of renewable energy matrix potential, forest potential, cost of land, we could be doing that in more favorable conditions. But for that, we need a serious discussion on end of deforestation and change of orientation of our economy. Now, the perception the world has of Brazil today is that the country is violent, irresponsible, and absent. So we need to change that perception. How can we do that? I think it, it is just for it is up for our governors to leverage the huge content being produced by Brazilian society, by the private sector, civil society, academia. There are plenty of reports and contributions you have been covering on your newspaper that shows the possibilities and opportunities for Brazil that are not being taken into consideration. That's the big challenge we have on our hands now.
Thank you, Marcelo. André, can you take over?
Sure. Well, I that's when I like to be on your side, asking questions and not being questioned by you. So yes, I'm going to accept. Right. So jokes aside, it is a privilege to be in any situation with all of you guys. But I have to take the opportunity. Now, back to Sinea. People talk about this climate justice thing. It is a pretty beautiful term, but it sounds a bit ethereal. I mean, it's on the air, climate justice. What is your take on that? How can you translate that for us in Brazil, for our ancestral peoples in Brazil, for our indigenous communities in Brazil? What is the practical application of this justice, of this climate justice to our traditional peoples, our indigenous peoples, in your opinion, Sinaya?
Well, André, when we talk about climate justice, we are talking about the rights of indigenous peoples. And to me, when we have these rights that ensured and effective, these are part of climate justice because we have the guarantee of land, the concrete guarantee that is in there in the constitution and many other law documents that ensures that this indigenous land is there for us to live with no suppression of rights. We are talking about climate justice, the resources that come with these mechanisms of financing in Brazil, and the possibility that they can be used with indigenous peoples and local community. And if this is happening in a very uh, egalitarian way and very transparent, we are talking about climate justice then as well. And we talk about climate justice when we see that local communities and indigenous peoples have their knowledge, they're keeping the forest standing, doing what they've been doing for millennials. And there are sectors that are not worried about this at all. They keep on working on their emissions. They keep on working, rushing back uh, against the time. They think of money earning and capitalism and nothing else. And they don't look at everything and the consequences of overlooking important things. We need to talk about climate justice and look at it. It is the ability to recognize the traditional peoples and the indigenous people and recognizing and acknowledging their voice because they already have the experience of living such impacts and they know what can be done in order to fight these changes. It's not about science alone, but also the empirical experience of these people who live in areas that are already affected. I don't know if I've answered the question, but I tried to bring you a general panorama of what climate justice is.
Your response there. These events for me are very important to bring a sense of reality to some concepts that sometimes are superficial on purpose, so people don't go deeper. Danny, can I ask Natalia a question now?
Sure, go ahead.
Natalia,
Natalia.
I wanted to zoom out a little bit. You talked about carbon markets and things I didn't understand, but I'd like to zoom out a little bit and use your knowledge on finances more broadly. In the beginning, I said that we are about to see something that happens in some economic sectors and in some companies. As Marcelo has just said, we see a redesign, a nearly complete design, complete redesign of the way you invest, the way you leverage finances, the way you analyze risks of investment. So there's a whole new finance framework. It isn't just coming; it is being born actually in Brazil and the world. Now, the bottom line is, how do you see these carbon markets somehow integrated or mixed, leveraging themselves in this new carbon scenario? In other words, there's there's an amount of money available in the world, and people decide on where this money to be allocated. Part is going to go to the carbon markets. How can the whole set work on this perspective to speed up the climate change mitigation processes? What do we have to do beyond creating and commenting on carbon markets from the financial standpoint?
Well, this is a very hard question, Andre, but let's do it. Okay, let's go ahead. What happens is the following. We need to be aware of this. We are living an economically disruptive moment. I say this because since I started working close and understanding decarbonization, I get really impressed with the challenge. Uh, we see how companies already understand that if they do not change the way they produce, they are going to be out of the game and out of the market. So we are redesigning new ways of doing things, new ways of relationships, new forms of relationship, especially in the financial sector. The CFD is something I have to mention. It's a list of recommendations so that companies can address climate issues, and this addresses things for banks as well. And what is the essence in this system? It is so that companies can permeate the risk, climate risk in their businesses, and they can tell the world how they are dealing with this. When the company can absorb this risk, work this risk, and communicate how they work this concern, and they are going to have specific rules to communicate all of that, there is a transparency and seriousness in how this is addressed, and the investors will be able to look at how the companies are dealing with this. You create companies that are going to be benefited from these new climate realities. They are now in the game, they have adapted, they are steady and firm, and some companies will not make it. This is changing the flow of financing. And this is separated between companies that will make it and companies that will not make it. And this is a possibility. In regard to the government and all the credits that can be created in order to facilitate businesses with new structures, this is a whole new set of financing uh, fash- uh, ways that can be created. Some companies deal with different levels of risks. We have to see that the new economy sectors, they deal with the climate situation with different approaches, and they are affected differently. So financing is going to come different as well. This flow of climate flow is brought naturally. And when we talk about strengthening our legislation in Brazil, it means that we should be able to get our offset, all of these credits that is not regulated, so that we can take our offset and send it outside Brazil. The use of international offset is very limited today. If I'm not wrong, what we have is something New Zealand and and Korea using it internationally partially. If Brazil manages to strengthen this credit, we will be able to bring this international capital within the perspective of the COP26. And it's a new capital coming in. We know capital is going to flow in different changes and in different rhythms. And there is no doubt that being transparent on how business is carried out and how projects are carried out and how the government addresses these issues in regard to climate change is going to make a whole difference to favor the income of new resources into the country.
Well, thank you, Natalia. I agree with you. I couldn't agree more. There's a whole processes redesign complementing what you said. There's a whole risk point. There's a climate risk, higher climate risk. They're going to struggle to access capital. It's going to be expensive. There's less competitiveness. So it's going to be fun to see the next few years. Then, if you allow me, I'd like to poke Marcelo because he's not going to escape. He's not going to go away without talking about ambition. We touched base to this topic, and then I'll give back to you, and then we move on. We have some questions popping up. Marcelo, I'd like to hear from you. Another concept, there's a certain degree of subjectiveness, is the increased ambition. We had the summit promoted by the US government in April. They talked about increased ambition. Many countries went there, country leaders went there, they said they would increase their ambition. There were scientists said we have to increase ambition, otherwise we won't reach 1.5 degree by the end of the century. Help me. I asked Sinaya to talk about climate justice. What is this? How can we increase ambition, especially for our Brazil? What is the meaning of increasing ambition to Brazil? So this is pretty connected to what I was talking to Danny, because the ruler that we use to talk about ambition in the global climate discussion started off with this 2050 discussion, because in the first scenario, the first IPCC scenarios, that's when we needed to see this big convergence. Now, after that, the situation became more complex, and we saw we needed to bring this ruler earlier. Now, Danny said what Danny was talking about. This basically shows, and we see in the following UN report showing this. If you add all the voluntary votes that the countries had, and if they were performed, we would still reach a temperature of 2.6 degrees, and it wouldn't reach 1.5 degree. Now, when there's an ambition request that is being actually, what was being demanded is that countries should review their homework and redo their commitments by asking within an optics of justice, which means the one that pollutes more has to do more, and those that polluted more historically has to do even more, is what your contribution for the problem, for the solution is. Now, the question we've been getting, there's something pretty interesting. The first time we heard this, actually after the Paris Agreement, was now when Biden made that summit in the beginning of his government. There are two important facts that appeared there. The first is Germany. They present all of a sudden that they would be neutral carbon in 2050. I mean, carbon neutral in 2050. They go back home. They are uh, they have a hard time from the German constitutional court, and the court says, well, your 2050 number doesn't work because it poses a high risk for future generations. And we got a request from social environmental um, classes led by youngsters, saying they are suing the German government because the government's ambition doesn't deliver climate security for them, because there's no planet left for them anymore when they grow up. So Marco had to redo her homework, and in 3 days' time, the German government provided a new goal for 2050. The other funny point, there's there was a lot of discussion about that. Germans, when it takes Germans 3 days to change national goal by doing calculations, that's a lot. When Bolsonaro went to the United Nations, he said, "Well, it's no longer 2060, but it's 2050." Nobody cared. But why is that? Although it is 10 years earlier, because we didn't say how we would make it, what we're gonna do, and how you show today and tomorrow in 2021, 2022, what you're doing to get there, that loses credibility totally. So the whole ambition thing in the political jargon, you just go there and promise again, one more time, something that is more ambitious. That is not going to solve the issue. What is going to solve the issue is concrete actions that we find in society with a high society pressure to align not only decarbonization, which is to remove greenhouse gas emissions, but also having inclusion. Now, I want to draw attention to the importance of the work the people from the Climate Center in Taiwanua did with ICS, because in Brazil, we used to have both talks in separate tracks. And it's very important to align them because there's an important value for us. In terms of Brazil, as I was saying before, we have countless contribution from coalition members, by the way, many of them, contributing to the feasibility and the opportunity it is for Brazil to have a socially fair and economically feasible and environmentally resilient, which means low carbon. So ambition, deep down, it means a view of a country and state. It means to have a guideline of a new economy, an economy that is prosperous, but it is based on a society that reduces and eliminates inequality as much as we eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. Cool, Marcelo. So yeah, we have to consider spaces and what adds transparency to the paths. Hopefully that's gonna happen. So can I pass the baton to you, Danny?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Andre. I'd like to ask Sinea a question if she's still here with us. Sinea, in regard to carbon credits from forest, of course. And then I'm going to hear Natalia with a similar question that was posed by someone in the chat. Sinea, I'd like to ask you the following. I know it's hard to say it, but anyway, the indigenous movement, has the carbon market concerns being addressed by the indigenous peoples during your meetings? Do you see different sides to the story? How is it for you, Sinea? Oh, well, Daniela. Yes, we have been discussing the carbon credits, especially when we are talking about state strategics. We need to discuss the safeguard the issues. We know that the carbon credits, they permeate the market as far as emissions are concerned, in reduction. And when you look at having or strategies for industries and factories and other questions, when we look at the indigenous peoples in this regard and talk about the forest, we need to have this issue clearer in regard to financing carbon credits with these projects and how these projects actually get to the forests. What are the safeguards that are already built up in Brazil and monitoring with these safeguards? And Natalia has mentioned something that, in my conception, in my very scarce knowledge in this regard, but we hear about this and the offset and all. I have a restriction, but that's within me in regard to offsetting in Brazil. I am not really in favor of that. And we need to know that when we talk about carbon, well, we all hear this. We hear about studies and all. And when uh, the Amazonic forest as a consumer of carbon and so on. We have indigenous peoples, we have people who live by the river. And when we talk about carbon credit, we see that it involves the traditional life, the cultural life of lives of these people. We need to have safeguard strategies. We need to have clear projects so that we can see how this implicates indigenous lives. There are several markets involved. There is the regulated and the non-regulated market, and we know they exist. And we know that many of the projects that are being put together in Brazil talk about this, but we need to be prepared. We need to be aligned in regard to market strategy and carbon credit market. We need to understand how this is going to happen within Brazil, considering the safeguards for us. We hear about this and we discuss this. We try to level up information, and so there are several meetings that carry out and address issues and create laws. And sometimes we just see this on paper and we don't see people really following anything. So this is what I see most. Okay, Daniele. Thank you, Sineya. And I find it interesting that you talk about climate justice. We talk about carbon credits all the time, but there are other discussions that are going to happen at COP. We are going to talk about loss and profits. And we usually talk about islands that have lost most things, but I think that everything comes together in a merging point with the indigenous people. I think this can be discussed in the future. This is another story, but Natalia, I'm going to reformulate one question that came from the audience. I think it was Archidano. This person asks the following. He wants to know about forest credits, and he asks the following. These forest credits were purchased by someone else, but then the forest burned. And then for climate, the climate received double emission. I'd like to know from you how this works. Has it got everything to do with this safeguard that Sinesia was mentioning? I'd like to see how you address this, how you discuss this at CEBEDS in regard to forest credits. Well, Dani, we do discuss this. In fact, when there is a conservation and structured project, it is structured considering this, taking that into account. There are rules and the project is controlled. A carbon credit is not created and not followed up. This is controlled annually. The carbon credit coming from forests, there is no discussion in this regard. But it is a good credit. It is a credit that should be regarded with, let's say, more seriousness so that we can avoid double counting. There are methodologies that already address this, and other markets that have managed to address this concern better. They are much more developed than Brazil, and Brazil is behind because the discussion was really trapped and locked. There are new technologies that could be put in place in order for us to clear this problem. Technologies of measuring credits is a recent challenge, not only for forests, but for agriculture as well. We need to bear in mind that the tropicalization of measuring credits in Brazil, they are going to be a turning point for us. Let's focus on bringing methodologies that have already been created in temperate countries trying to use our own tropical characteristics within the process. Yes, thank you, Natalia. And Andrea, if I can pose a question to Marcelo, because at a certain moment, Marcelo, you've you've mentioned the Brazilian image outside, and you've mentioned some really hard adjectives. You said irresponsible and absent. And I'd like you to comment further on this. I'd like to know how you see this moment of Brazil in COP, because there is a large credibility problem.
So, Daniel, what I was saying is that the perception the world has of Brazil is that it is violent, irresponsible, and absent. Why irresponsible? Because the way Brazil handled the, both sanitary and environmental issue with the repeated deforestation records. Today, if I'm not mistaken, there is a new result of Amazon, one of our partners, showing another deforestation record this month. And why absent? Because we always, if you think Brazil has always joined this climate negotiations, not only have we joined, but we have helped build the solution of the climate of the world climate change. It's important to remind our audience that the Paris Agreement is called Paris Agreement because it happened in Paris. But but for started, it was a global agreement, and wouldn't have happened without Brazil. This is not me. This is the COP21's president that said that. Now, this Brazilian moment, which is pretty negative, concerns, worries not only Brazilian civil society, but also the academia when we see science being mitigated in a private sector because they're hardly concerned with the image of the Brazilian product in Brazil and abroad. Now, of course, that now you see letters and manifestations from different sectors that you didn't used to see. You usually had civil society and government complaining. It wasn't common for you to see a manifestation with the private sector, civil society, and academia, sometimes together, sometimes separately, charging more ambition, more seriousness, more commitment. Now, the Brazilian image is not going to improve before we have concrete results. It is useless to have webinars. It's useless to have talks. What people want is data. They want to see a plan, demonstrated one, proven one with applied reality. As important as doing the right recipe is stopping doing what is wrong. So fighting deforestation, the command and control actions, the end of violence, we see illegal land grabbing, violence against indigenous riverside communities. This has to stop. Brazil has done that. We know how to do that. We're not asking for something that, as a country, we are unable to offer. The other point we need is with data and and social engagement, we walk the right path, and we have a demonstration with the coalition document and so many others that are being published. The Brazilian society is ready and prepared to to put Brazil in its place of value as a great country because it's part of the solution that doesn't have to be the sixth most polluted country in the world, because the reason for us to be in this terrible ranking is our soil use and deforestation, and the country that has solutions to make its economy be socially fair, environmentally responsible.
Thank you, Marcelo. André?
I wish I would stay for one more hour, but then they're going to switch off our mics and screens. Unfortunately, I didn't even notice. We have 2 to 3 minutes to go. There are questions like plenty of questions. I'm sorry. The debate was so great, but I'm going to ask for one more minute from each one of us, and including you, for us to wrap up. I would like to thank you one more time, but I'd like to make a round. So, Marcelo, you're the only guy except for me. If you would make a quick comment, one minute just to wrap up. If you could talk about the energy transition, that would be nice because we did mention that. But make yourself at home to make your last comment, and then over to Natalia, Sinea, and Dani. You're going to enlighten us with with your last few words. So I'm going to be pretty concise in this transition because I want to use this minute to talk to say that since I voted in the premium, there's a very important premium in Brazil, an award which is Women in Press that selects the best journalists in Brazil. In the press category, press journalist category, we have Dani Chiaretti with four more journalists, including Patricia Campos Melo. I'd like to make this public acknowledgement here that your name is not there by chance. And for me, you are the winner of the award just because you were there.
Oh, well, thank you, Marcelo.
The energy transition, I have to say that in coalition, we tackled this very carefully in our documents. And this is another opportunity that Brazil missed out on. Brazil shouldn't be investing the way we are in in fossil fuel, especially in the volume it is taking towards natural gas, because we are choking the potential of renewables that we have. So we are shooting our own foot. And the acknowledgement not only to this great panel we have today, but an acknowledgement to all the members of the coalition. We are here to represent 300 organizations that compose the coalition, 6 years of history that has demonstrating no matter how hard it is to have this hard talk with civil society, with the academia. Brazil is so polarized. In the coalition, we have not only convergence, we have dialogue, but there is also consensus. One of the biggest consensus we have is that we believe in this country and we are going to make a difference. We are going to build a better Brazil together with all of you that want a better Brazil. Thank you. Thank you, Marcelo. Without further ado, Natalia, over to you.
Well, my final considerations come in a sense that we think of the moment we are living now, and let's recognize that the private sector can be a very good driver for the moment that we are now. And with three elements, we can get to what we need: organization of our decarbonization policies, respecting science, and it's very important, with the use of our solutions that are nature based, and the involvement of the private sector, we can get our economy on track and achieve what we need. It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hopefully, one more time. I used that word many times today. Hopefully. Let's talk together, but we build concrete things there. Yes. Sinea, your inspired comments to wrap up. Oh, after that, Dunny.
Well, I would like to thank you for this space so that I could bring the indigenous voice for this event. I would like to thank you, Andre, Natalia, Daniela. We don't have spaces for ourselves every day so that we can talk about our plans, all of the fights that we are addressing. I'd like to leave a message to the private sector. When you think of a plan, when you assemble a plan, remember us. We are the indigenous peoples inside the forests. Please look at us when you have decarbonization plannings. Remember, there are local communities there, there are indigenous peoples there. Andre, We are hand in hand with everyone, especially with partner organizations, because we can help each other understanding what is happening in those spaces. Just the way I am right now assembling a plan in regard to climate change here in Roraima. So I think it's really important. And the message I leave to you is that we have to look at how we can help ourselves, each other in emission reduction, because it affects the indigenous people, but it also affects everyone globally. If you are at COP, please remember we are going to be the voices of our local traditional people. It was a great pleasure to be able to collaborate despite fire. Andre, you made me cry. I never cried in a meeting. But when you mention where I am and what I am doing, because people do have all the tools to address these issues, and here everything is just so hard, and we just have the knowledge. We have the knowledge, and it's a lot to address and deal ev- with all of the problems that we are facing. We are at COP and at COP 26, and the indigenous people have their strength, and we have the knowledge we're going to share to everyone. Thank you.
Even though you were through your mobile, you nailed it. Yeah. Now imagine her speaking on stage. Sanaya, thank you with capital letters. I will be listening to you at COP.
Thank you.
Even
Thank you. Okay, greetings to you all. I'm leaving. Bye bye.
Danny, mine are Marcelo's words. I'm so happy. Actually, I was the one who should make the comment, but he robbed my line here. We are brothers in faith, so mine are his words are mine. I'm happy to share this afternoon with you. Would you like to wrap up, Danny?
Thank you very much, Andre, Marcelo. Thank you for mentioning these awards that I am probably, well, I am one of the finalists for this award. So, along with colleagues that I admire a lot, but I am very happy because I believe this climate theme coming so strong in so many debates. This is bringing some projection. So our work also has this side. So it is good. What I wanted to say is that I saw the beginning of the coalition in 2015, and as a reporter, I covered the story. And I do admire this effort because it's a democratic effort that is so strong with very different actors with different points of view. And some of them were even here today, but still sit and talk and try to understand each other, trying to reach a common goal. And I think this is a very beautiful exercise to see in Brazil. New networks have been formed, new consultations, new initiatives, such as the way Marcelo mentioned. And I saw this carbon market discussion getting more mature. And I am really very happy and honored to be able to take part of this series of webinars with Valor Econômico. I would like to thank you all very much. This is a beautiful exercise, a joint effort, and a report will be published shortly. So this is it. Let's just see if this COP is going to bring the best results that we expect. And we thank you very much for this.
Thanks, guys. Congrats, Danny. Bye, Natalia. Bye, Marcelo. Bye
Thank
bye.
you, everyone.
Enjoy the rest of your week.
Bye. Thank you.